Welcome back to our course on construction grammar. Today we're going to talk about usage-based approaches. First of all, a quick revision. Constructions, as we said in this course, are form and meaning pairings. And the huge claim of construction grammar is that all levels of description involve these form-meaning pairings. So the knowledge of language is known as the constructicon, the network of your constructions. Now, when do we postulate that something is a construction? Well, all approaches would say if there is something idiosyncratic, if you have to learn something about it, if the relationship between form and meaning is arbitrary, as in kick the bucket or spill the beans, you have good evidence that it should be a construction that is stored by speakers. But what about frequency? Well, usage-based approaches would say that frequency plays an enormous role in entrenching constructions. So some approaches in construction grammar, known as complete inheritance approaches, like sign-based construction grammar or Berkeley construction grammar, do not believe that frequency is important. Usage-based approaches, on the other hand, focus on the importance of frequency. And today, we will see why there is good evidence for this. So usage-based construction grammar makes the claim that constructions are the important bit, the central units of language, and that all levels of description involve form meaning pairs. On top of that, they claim that the input for mental representations, how the constructions get into your head, are specific usage events with rich contextual clues. As Bybee notes, this information consists of phonetic detail, including redundant and variable features, the lexical items and constructions used, the meaning, inferences made from this meaning, and from the context, and properties of the social, physical, and linguistic context. So the idea is that constant dripping wears away the stone. Let's just have an example of this, how usage affects your storage and how exemplar storage, individual tokens, affect your mental grammar. Bybee in 2000 looked at final t and d deletion. This happens in many varieties. In this case, she looked at American English. So a word like hold could either be pronounced as hold or whole. Test could be pronounced as test or tess. Now Bybee asked herself, does frequency matter here? So do more frequent elements, because they're used more often, turn out to be more prone to reduction? Well, as a proxy for frequency, she looked at a corpus, the Brown corpus, which by now is a bit dated, but back in the day was a good reference corpus. It contains 1 million words, and she split up the words in half because half of the words had a token frequency of 30, which means that words like the and of appear quite often, way more than 30 times, and other words like hypnosis, for example, might only appear once. And it turned out that half of the types, half of the words in the corpus had a frequency of 30 or higher, and the other half had a frequency of lower than 30. So this is the frequency threshold that she chose. Let's look at her results. In figure 1, you see the final t and d deletion in all words, taking into account the frequency of words. And as you can see, if the words had a high frequency, they were much more likely to show deletion, whereas the ones in the low frequency bin were much more likely to show non-deletion. Now, how could this be? Well, if deletion just took place randomly, so you didn't store the last time that we reduced a word, then all words should have the same likelihood of being reduced. High frequency words will appear more often, but they should have the same likelihood of reduction as low frequency words. But this is not what we see. So what we see is that a high frequency word, like test, has a much higher chance of being reduced. And this means that once you hear it in a reduced form, this is stored in an exemplar kind of fashion. So a word like test appears very often as test, test, test without the final t, and each of these instances is stored. And then it gets cumulative weight. The more often you hear it, the more often it is reduced, the more often it is reduced, the more often you're going to store it as such. So frequency plays a crucial role for whether a word has reduction or not. And this shows that the mind must somehow register this frequency. Of course, this doesn't happen in a conscious fashion, but unconsciously, in your mind, you keep track of how often you heard something. Now, what about final t and does that are parts of the allomorph of the morpheme past tense, as in loved and kissed? In loved, because it ends in a final voiced sound, you get the d in English, and in kissed, s ends in a voiceless sound, so the realization of the morpheme is kissed. So we got a final t and d. But this is of course different from hold and test, because if you hear whole and test without the final consonant, you will still be able to know what it means. You don't lose any meaning information. With loved and kissed, however, if you leave out the final t or d, you lose the information that the verb is past tense. So we would assume that in these cases the meaning plays a huge role and should disfavor deletion. And this is what we find. So the high frequency past tense realizations and the low frequency past tense realizations both predominantly favor non-deletion. But in those cases where there is deletion, as you can see in the light grey bars, the high frequency past tense verb show a higher rate of reduction. So even for these, frequency plays a role. And that means that it must be stored in the mind. This was some very good first evidence that we store words in an exemplar kind of fashion, that constructions are stored in an exemplar fashion, and that entrenchment depends on frequency. Now, so far, we've only looked at the frequency of substantive constructions, of single words. But what about schemas? Kassenheiser and Goldberg devised a clever experiment to test how children can acquire schemas based on input frequency. So for their generalization experiment, they used a non-English phrasal pattern. Noun phrase 1, noun phrase 2, followed by a nonsense verb that ended in O. And this was supposed to encode a novel meaning of NP1 appearing on into NP2. So the rabbit, the hat moo-pooed was supposed to mean the rabbit appeared on a hat. The reason why they used these nonsense verbs and these new structures was of course because they wanted to test young children, and they had to make sure that this was definitely a structure that none of them had heard before. For the experiment they recruited 51 subjects, American children with the age of 5 to 7. The training session, and that's important, lasted only 3 minutes, or even less than that. And in the training sessions, the children saw 8 short clips of a puppet performing various actions while hearing the new construction, so that they were able to infer what the construction is supposed to mean. Let's have a look at one of the training clips that Adele Goldberg was kind enough to share with me.
The sun, the sky, Fagos. The sun, the sky, Fagoed. The frog, the box, Moopos. The frog, the box, Moopoed.
So as you can see, these are short, nice little clips geared towards children, and they provide a scene so that the kids could infer the meaning of something appearing somewhere on something, like in the sky or on a box, and they heard the novel constructions. In the experiment, Kassenheiser and Goldberg used 3 groups. There was a balanced group that saw the clips and heard a balanced set of 5 new novel verbs. A skewed group that saw the clips and heard a set of novel verbs, but one verb was more frequent than the other ones. I will show you in a second what that looked like. So they had a prototype for the construction, one type that appeared with a high token frequency, and of course a control group who just saw the clips. Table 1 shows you the difference between the 2 groups that were tested. In the balanced frequency group, they had verbs like moopu, veku, sutu, kibu, and figu, so the rabbit, the hat, moopooed, or the frog, the box, vekued. In the skewed frequency group, however, they had one verb, moopu, which appeared more frequently than all the others. So the rabbit, the hat, moopooed, or the frog, the box, moopooed. There were still type frequencies, or different types. There were still veko, sutu, and kibu, but in the skewed frequency group, one verb like moopu acted like an anchor. It was the prototype that dominated the input. So then the actual experiment started. After the training, all groups saw 2 new clips side by side, all in all 12 clips. In clip A, a character appeared in the scene, so that fitted the meaning of the novel construction. In the other clip, a character just performed an action while remaining in constant view, so the frog was just sitting there doing something, but it didn't appear on the scene or on anything. So this second clip didn't fit the novel construction. Then the children heard 6 transitive constructions, noun phrase, verb, noun phrase, that fitted clip B, and 6 times they heard the novel construction with a novel V. So the sailor, the pond, knee, booze fits the pattern that they saw, NP1, NP2, novel verb, but they hadn't seen Nibu. So this experiment doesn't test whether the kids learn the specific verbs, mupu for example, but whether they can generalize to the underlying schema. So how many novel constructions were correctly identified by the kids? Figure 1 gives you the results from Kessenheiser and Goldberg. All in all kids were tested on 6 instances of the novel construction. So what would you expect from the control group? Well, pretty much what you see there, that they get 50-50 right, because they hadn't heard anything, and if you just click by chance on 1 out of 2 options, you get 50% right, which is about 3 out of 6. The balanced condition, where there was type frequency, different verbs appearing in this novel construction, and then the kids were tested, already shows a significantly better result than chance. In this group, the children got 4 out of 6 right. And considering that they only had a very short training session of 3 minutes, this result is actually quite impressive, because it shows that the kids must have picked up on the meaning of the abstract construction. And finally, most impressive out of it all, is the result of the skewed group. In the skewed group, the children got 5 out of 6 right on average. That means that they must have entrenched the template, because remember, in the short 3-minute training session, they didn't see any of the verbs that they were actually tested on. So they could only get it right if they had the schema entrenched. So usage-based construction grammar assumes that input frequency is important. What the BIBI study showed that high token frequency is important for the entrenchment of one specific construction. If you hear test as a reduced test, and you hear it again and again and again, then this reduced form will be more strongly entrenched. High type frequency, on the other hand, if you get many different verbs, nibu, veiku, and so on, allow you to entrench to a schema, because then you know, well, there's a slot in the construction. And this entrenchment then leads to a schematic template. Finally, Kessenheiser and Goldberg showed that the ideal input for children and for humans in general to acquire constructional schema is high type frequency, many different verbs, for example, appearing in a slot, but at the same time one high frequent prototype, like mupu, which anchors the whole construction. And as we will see in the session on language acquisition, uncannily enough, this is exactly the kind of input that caretakers unconsciously provide for children. Now, another crucial tenet of usage-based construction grammar we've already seen in the last sessions on the constructional network. So we know that these exemplars, true, friendly, happy, and Gucci, untrue, unfriendly, unhappy, and ungucci, will all be entrenched differently depending on their input frequency, their token frequency. But on top of that, because we get different types, untrue, unfriendly, unhappy, we get to a schema, the unadjective construction, which means not the property. In the same vein, true, friendly, happy will lead to the entrenchment of the adjective construction, because there is type frequency. The two are going to be linked, however, as we said in the last session, so the constructicon is not just a list of constructions, but a network of construction, with horizontal links between our schemas. Another aspect that usage-based construction grammar emphasizes is analogy. Analogy is if you see and detect similarities across patterns. And for schematization, that is also important. Take a look at the chef is cooking the fish and the mother is cooking the chicken. By analogy, by detecting the similarity across the two, children can of course generalize more abstract semantic roles. So it's not just the mother that is cooking, or the father, but it's a chef that can do the cooking as well. So there is an abstract role for cook. And in the same sense, the fish and the chicken show you that there's a slot, you get type frequency, but underlyingly, via analogy, you know that they all have in common that it's something that you can eat. So food. So this shows you how analogy also plays a role in detecting the semantic meaning and the formal template of a construction. When you then come across instances like the wolf is killing the sheep, you can generalize to an even higher schema, because now you can still see that A is Ving B, so that's the constant part, but the wolf is doing something to the sheep in the same sense that the chef is doing something to the fish. There is a false dynamic relationship between them in that the light blue element, the chef, the mother and the wolf, is exerting force, and this force changes the fish, the chicken and the sheep. They are the patient of this action. So again, analogy allows you to detect the pattern and to generalize the semantic roles here as well as the formal pattern. Finally, usage-based construction grammar also emphasizes the importance of competition, or sometimes also called preemption. Take a look at the pattern write, writer, sing, singer and win, winner. In all of these, you've got the noun created off the verb by adding the er suffix. So of course there's going to be a relationship between the two, and from a construction grammar perspective we would see two schemas for a verb and the noun, and they are linked by a bidirectional link as we saw in the last session. But why don't we get steal, stealer? Steal is there, so why can't we, via analogy, also create stealer? Well, you will probably already know the answer. Stealer is blocked because you got an existing word thief. And if children hear thief, they know that there is already a full meaning pairing available for this concept. Preemption can also explain competition at a more abstract level. Take a look at he gave John the book, he gave the book to John. John in both instances is the recipient of the action, the book is the theme which he receives. Now for many verbs of giving, we've got both options. You can have the recipient right after the verb, he gave John the book, or you can put it at the end in a prepositional phrase that expresses a caused motion, meaning he gave the book to John. There are, however, some verbs like donate that do not work in the ditransitive construction. So he donated charity, the book doesn't work. You've got to say he donated the book to charity. How can children learn that, however, if they never hear he donated charity the book? Why don't they say this? Well, it turns out that even though the alternation is generally okay, there is subtle statistical information that helps kids avoid saying he donated charity the book. Though it doesn't completely preclude it, someone somewhere might actually say it, but the likelihood of it appearing is way lower than he donated the book to charity. Because if one variant is expected, say for example if the recipient is a pronoun, he gave him the book, he gave the book to him. Out of the two, he gave him the book is the preferred option because him is a pronoun, it's short, the recipient comes first. But with donate, we don't have this option. So if a child hears the structure he donated the book to her much more often than expected, it can register that the pronoun, the recipient, is put in the caused motion construction and not he donated her the book, which should be expected by the processing constraint. So the learner can assume, and by this we mean unconsciously detect, that he donated her the book is not possible. It should strongly be expected because the recipient is a pronoun, but you don't get it, so the child can unconsciously assume that this structure is preempted, so that the structure he donated the book to her is the structure that preempts, prevents this other structure. Finally, we've already seen the networks. Usage-based construction grammar assumes taxonomic networks. So instances like jump and eat and clean your room will lead to a verb generalization imperative construction. Be happy, be nice will lead to a be adjective construction. And comparatively negative imperatives like don't jump, don't do this, or don't be adjective constructions, don't be cruel, don't be silly, will lead to the don't be adjective and a don't be verb construction for the imperative respectively. And then you can generalize to higher levels, positive imperatives and negative imperatives. So from the micro constructions, jump, eat your beans, or be happy, don't be silly, we get to meso constructions which have slots because of the type frequency. These are going to be related, and if there is enough evidence, we also get a fairly abstract macro construction for imperatives. Summing up, usage-based construction grammar assumes that input is important, and that means type as well as token frequency. Type frequency leads to schematization because there is analogy and because you got type frequency. On top of that, as we've seen, schematization is learned best if you have high type frequency, but also one token that acts as a high frequency prototype. Competition and preemption also shape your network. There are product-oriented schemas, and for that I would refer you back to the session on rules and schemas. So product-oriented means that the relationships in the networks are going to be bidirectional. It's not input-output, but schemas are related in a bidirectional manner. And finally, semantic similarity influences the taxonomy. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. These are my references. I look forward to seeing you again next time.